It's the church video series and it's coming at you, lesson number 10. Today we're talking about exposure from ProChurchTools.com. My name is Brady. Welcome to this lesson. Exposure is a term that refers to how much light is let into your camera and your image. This is what exposure looks like when there is too much light being allowed and the image is too bright. This is what exposure looks like when there is not enough brightness and the image is too dark. And this is what a properly exposed image looks like. We talked in a recent lesson about our camera's limitations due to compression, and the best way to overcome these limitations is to properly expose our images. Having a properly exposed image means that there's detail in the brightest areas, details in the darkest areas, and details in the middle areas. And when your image is properly exposed like this, you'll be retaining as much information as your camera is capable of, and that is exactly what we want. You might be asking, how do I achieve perfect exposure? Well, I am glad you asked, and the way to achieve perfect exposure is by using what is called the exposure triangle. Now, the exposure triangle is basically this: 3 different settings within your camera that you can tweak to affect and set exposure. And all 3 settings work together as a team, and they offset and balance each other. And these 3 settings are the 3 things we talked about in the last 3 lessons. How convenient: aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. The great thing about the exposure triangle is that we have 3 different settings that we can tweak and choose from. We don't have to rely on just one. So let's say you want to use the 2-to-1 rule that we talked about in our last lesson on shutter speed. Well, that means that our shutter speed is set. We're not going to touch that. So when we're working on exposure, we can tweak ISO and aperture. Or let's say you have a certain aperture you want to use. You want to get some really nice, beautiful, shallow depth of field, and so you want to keep your aperture set on f1.4. Well, if that's the case, that means that when you're setting exposure, you can use the ISO and the shutter speed. The important thing to remember is that you have 3 different settings to choose from when you're setting your exposure, and all 3 of them work together. So if you set one, you might have to set another one to offset and balance them. Or if you don't want to set one, you can choose another in lieu of it. So now that we know what exposure is and how to set it, we're going to look at how to make sure we're actually doing it right, because it can get a little tricky. So here are 3 ways to achieve great, perhaps even perfect exposure. Number 1, the LCD screen. Most likely, your camera has an LCD screen, and that's what you're using to monitor what you're shooting, and that's great. It's a great start for knowing what you're framing and the motion of the shot. Unfortunately, LCD screens are not the best for checking and setting exposure because it can be difficult to properly gauge what you're seeing on the screen. LCD screens are very reflective, and if there's any light that's shining on the screen, you're going to find it very difficult to properly set the highlights and the shadows in your image. The LCD screen, though, is great for setting initial exposure and getting close, so I always use it first, I eyeball it, and then I move on to more precise methods. Number 2, the in-camera meter. The in-camera meter is pretty simple to use. This is what it looks like, and when you have your subject ready and you have your camera pointed at your shot, it will display a measurement on the meter. Basically, you want to get the meter as close to 0 as possible. If the meter is reading to the left, that may be a good indication that your image is underexposed. And if the meter is reading to the right, that may be a good indication that the image is overexposed. Just try to get it as close to the center as possible, and you're another step towards great exposure. Number 3, the histogram. The histogram is another precise method of checking and setting your exposure, and many cameras have the ability to display the histogram while you're shooting. All you have to do is enable it in the settings. A histogram is an analysis of your image with black on the left side and white on the right side. If your image is underexposed, it will show a histogram reading that is pushed towards the left. If your image is overexposed, the histogram reading will be pushed to the right. You'll know that your image is properly exposed when the histogram reading shows an even distribution of spikes across the board. Well, there you have it, our lesson on exposure. Now, camera settings like these can be a bit tricky. It took me a while to learn them properly and be able to use them appropriately. So if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below and I'll surely do my best to answer them. And head over to ProChurchTools.com for more video training on church media and church video, as well as tons of articles. And you can get your very own copy of our ebook, The 5 Commands of Church Media, absolutely free when you sign up. Great news. I'll see you guys next time.